Welcome back. Tonight I want to talk about a particular kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of chasing. Chasing a relationship that keeps slipping just out of reach the moment you close the distance.
Chasing a level of income that always seems to sit one step ahead of you, no matter how hard you work toward it.
Approval, recognition, a breakthrough, some sign that things are finally turning in your favor. Most people quietly assume the answer to not having something is to want it harder, reach for it faster, chase it more aggressively than before. And most people chasing that way stay tired, stay tense, and stay largely empty-handed for far longer than they expected to. Neville Goddard taught something that runs directly against this instinct. And it takes real courage to actually believe it the first time you hear it laid out plainly. He taught that the moment you're chasing something, you are, by definition, confirming that you don't yet have it. And that confirmation, repeated daily without anyone noticing they're doing it, is precisely what keeps the thing at a distance. The desire isn't drawn closer by pursuit. It's drawn closer by assumption, not by running toward it with increasing urgency, but by settling quietly and convincingly into the state of already having it, long before any outer evidence agrees with you. Tonight we're going to walk through this slowly and completely. Why chasing anything actually pushes it further away structurally, not just poetically or as a nice turn of phrase. What it really means to let something come to you, and why that isn't remotely the same doing nothing at all. The difference between desire and desperation, which look almost identical on the surface but are not the same inner state in any meaningful way. How to recognize the exact moment you've slipped from assuming into chasing without noticing the shift happen. What role patience actually plays here, properly understood, not the anxious patience of gritted teeth, but the settled patience of someone who already, quietly, knows how the story ends. And how to build a daily practice that stops fueling the chase entirely and starts feeding the assumption instead. Day after day, until the assumption becomes the more natural of the two states. This is a long one tonight. Get settled. Let's begin properly. Why chasing confirms the absence. Here is the structural problem with chasing, and it's worth understanding clearly rather than simply accepting it on faith. Because once you actually see it laid bare, you can't easily unsee it again. To chase something is to act continuously and repeatedly from the position of not having it. Every phone check for a reply that hasn't come yet. Every rehearsed conversation preparing carefully for an outcome you haven't actually secured. Every extra hour of effort thrown at something out of a quiet, unspoken fear that if you stop pushing even for a moment, it will disappear entirely and be lost for good. All of it, however well-intentioned and however sincere the underlying desire genuinely is, rests on the exact same foundation. I do not have this yet, and I'm afraid of what happens if I ever stop trying to get it. The trouble is that this foundation doesn't remain politely hidden in the background of your mind while you go about your day. It becomes the actual state you're living from. Hour by hour, day after day, whether you intended that or not. And your outer experience, Neville taught consistently across decades of lectures, doesn't organize itself around what you say you want out loud, or even what you sincerely believe you want. It organizes itself around what you're actually assuming to be true underneath the surface while you move through your ordinary hours. So if the assumption running quietly beneath the chase is, I don't have this, and it may never come, that is the assumption doing the real structural work regardless of how much energy, hope, or sincere effort layered visibly on top of it.
This is precisely why chasing so often produces the exact opposite of what it's aiming to achieve. The relationship pursued too hard tends to pull away, not because the other person is deliberately punishing the pursuit, but because pursuit itself carries an unmistakable undertone that most people can sense even when they couldn't name it if asked directly. A subtle, persistent signal of insufficiency, of, I need this in order to finally feel complete, which naturally tends to make people want to create distance rather than move closer. The opportunity chased too aggressively tends to slip through the fingers at the very last moment, not through simple bad luck, but because desperation narrows perception considerably, causing the chaser to grip so tightly onto what's directly in front of them that they squeeze right past the very openings they were actually hoping to reach. None of this means desire itself is somehow the problem, and it's worth being clear about that distinction. Desire is simply a compass, quietly pointing toward what genuinely matters to you underneath everything else. The problem was never the wanting itself. The problem has always been the assumption of lack that chasing quietly reinforces every single time you engage in it, whether you're aware of the reinforcement happening or not. The fishermen stopped casting. There's a simple way to picture this shift, and it's worth holding on to because it's easy to return to mentally whenever you notice yourself slipping back into old familiar habit. Picture two fishermen sitting on the exact same riverbank on the exact same morning. The first casts his line, waits only 30 seconds or so, reels it in impatiently, casts again almost immediately, reels it in again shortly after, over and over, faster and faster as the morning wears on, increasingly convinced that more motion and more visible effort must eventually produce a bite if he just keeps aggressively enough. He is genuinely exhausted within the hour, visibly frustrated, and more often than not, he goes home with an empty basket. Because the constant motion of his line disturbs the very water he's fishing in, scattering exactly what he was hoping to attract before it ever had a real chance to approach. The second fisherman casts once, settles comfortably onto the bank, and waits with genuine, unforced ease.
He isn't checking the line every few seconds out of anxious habit.
He isn't secretly convinced that stillness automatically means failure is coming. He trusts the whole process enough to let it unfold at its own natural pace. In that unhurried, he actually remains far more alert to the moment something genuinely bites, precisely because he isn't drowning that subtle signal out with constant, anxious motion of his own making. This isn't an argument for laziness, and it's important to say that plainly, because the analogy can be misread that way if you're not careful. The second fisherman still showed up at the river that morning. He still baited his hook properly. He still cast his line with clear, deliberate intention behind it. The difference was never really about effort versus no effort at all. It was about frantic, repeated grasping versus settled, genuinely attentive presence. One approach disturbs the water constantly. The other lets the water simply do what water naturally does, largely undisturbed, while remaining fully ready to respond the instant something actually happens. Your own desire works in exactly the same way. The frantic recasting, the constant checking, the anxious follow-up messages, the repeated mental rehearsal of what still hasn't happened yet.
disturbs the very inner state you genuinely need in order to actually receive what you're after in the first place.
Stillness, real and settled stillness, isn't giving up on the desire at all. It's finally simply getting out of your own way. Assumption versus desperation. It's worth drawing a genuinely sharp, clear line here, because these two inner states are frequently confused with one another, and confusing them is exactly what tends to keep people stuck chasing for years on end without ever fully understanding why nothing seems to change for them. Desperation says quietly and constantly underneath everything else, I need this, and without it, some part of me will remain permanently incomplete. It's future-focused in a genuinely painful way, always reaching toward a moment that hasn't arrived yet, always measuring the present moment against a felt absence that hasn't been resolved. Even when desperation gets dressed up carefully in positive-sounding language, vision boards, repeated affirmations, hours of dedicated visualization practice, the underlying emotional posture underneath all of it often remains exactly the same as it always was. Reaching, training, checking constantly for signs, quietly panicking whenever none appear right on schedule. Assumption says something entirely, categorically different. This is already mine, in the way that genuinely matters. And the outer confirmation, simply a matter of time slowly catching up to what's already settled within me. It's present focused rather than future focused. It doesn't need to check constantly for signs because it isn't waiting nervously for anything at all. It's already standing calmly on the other side of the waiting, at genuine ease, regardless of what the calendar happens to show on any particular day. Here's a simple, honest test you can actually run on yourself without needing anyone else to evaluate it or weigh in. Ask yourself directly, if I never receive one more piece of external confirmation about this particular desire, no reply, no offer, no visible sign of any kind, could I still feel genuinely at peace tonight, right now, as things stand? If the honest answer is no, you're very likely still chasing whatever language or technique you're currently using to describe your practice. If the honest answer is yes, genuinely and truthfully yes, you've probably already moved into assumption, even if the outer world simply hasn't caught up to it yet. This test isn't meant to shame anyone who finds themselves squarely in the no category when they're honest with themselves. Nearly everyone starts there with anything they want badly enough to be reading something like this. It's only meant to give you an accurate starting point, a clear read on where you're genuinely standing today, so you know precisely which direction actually needs your attention next, what it actually means to let it come to you. People sometimes hear the phrase, let it come to you, and quietly translate it, without meaning to, into nothing at all, and simply wait. That's a real misunderstanding worth clearing up directly and carefully, because it causes a great deal of unnecessary confusion, and frankly, a fair amount of unnecessary passivity that gets wrongly attributed to this teaching by people who never fully understood it. Letting something come to you doesn't mean abandoning normal, sensible engagement with your actual life and its practical demands. It means engaging with that same life from a genuinely different internal position than the one that produces chasing in the first place. You still show up where showing up makes sense. You still take the reasonable, natural steps sitting directly in front of you. You still have the necessary conversation, send the relevant message, apply for the position, put in whatever work the situation genuinely and reasonably calls for. What changes isn't the presence or absence of action itself. The inner posture running underneath that same action. Someone caught in chasing sends a message and then checks their phone every few minutes afterward, mentally rehearsing the specific reply they're hoping desperately to receive, growing measurably more anxious with each passing hour of silence that follows. Someone who's genuinely let go sends that exact same message, worded much the same way, and then simply goes on with the rest of their day, fully present to whatever else is actually in front of them in that moment. Not because they don't genuinely care about the outcome, but because they've already settled the matter internally and no longer require external confirmation in order to feel at ease within themselves. This is a genuinely subtle distinction, and it can take real sustained practice to actually locate the difference in your own body, rather than merely understanding it as an interesting concept. But it is the entire difference between viewing further and feeding the assumption instead. Same visible actions on the surface in both cases. Completely different inner states running underneath them. And it's that underlying state, not the visible action itself, that ultimately determines what actually tends to unfold from here. An extended example. Application that waited. Let me walk through a fuller, more complete scene, because this particular distinction is far easier to actually use in your own life once you can see it applied clearly to something specific and genuinely ordinary. Imagine someone who has applied for something they truly want. It could be a role, an opportunity, an invitation of some kind. Period after is already stretched on considerably longer than they originally expected it to. The old familiar chasing pattern looks something like this. Checking email obsessively throughout the day, drafting and redrafting a follow-up message 4 or 5 separate times before finally sending a version carefully stripped of any visible sign of eagerness. Mentally rehearsing worst-case explanations for the ongoing silence. Feeling the tension in their chests rise a little further every single time a notification sound turns out to be something else entirely unrelated. Now imagine that same person in the exact same circumstance, approaching it differently instead. They send one clear, reasonable follow-up message, not out of anxious pressure, but simply because it happens to be a genuinely sensible step to take at this point. And then they deliberately, consciously turn their attention elsewhere afterward, not through forced denial or artificial distraction, but through a real, genuine inner settling. A few quiet minutes spent feeling what it will actually be like once this matter is resolved favorably, followed by a conscious, deliberate decision to trust that feeling rather than continuing to chase active confirmation of it throughout the rest of the day. The waiting period itself, measured purely in calendar days, might end up being genuinely identical in both versions of this story. But the person actually living through it experiences something entirely different in each case.
One version of this story is exhausting, marked by a slow, steady erosion of peace with every additional day of silence that passes.
The other version is calm, even genuinely pleasant much of the time, because the peace involved was never actually outsourced to the eventual outcome in the first place. It was already fully present, internally, entirely regardless of what the calendar happened to show on any given day.
And here's the part genuinely worth sitting with, honestly.
The settled version of this person tends to notice things the anxious version consistently misses. A different, unrelated opportunity that quietly crosses their path while they're not busy being consumed by checking their inbox every 10 minutes throughout the day. A useful, valuable conversation they might have brushed straight past entirely if their attention had remained fully absorbed by anxious waiting instead. The chase, ironically and almost cruelly, tends to actively blind people to exactly the kind of
Openings that would otherwise make the chase completely unnecessary in the first place. The discomfort of letting go.
It's worth being genuinely honest about something here, because pretending this particular shift is effortless does a real disservice to anyone actually attempting to practice it in their own life. Letting go of the chase often feels, especially at first, like you're actively risking the very thing you want most.
The mind protests loudly. If I stop pushing now, won't it just slip away from me entirely? Isn't effort the actual thing that makes anything happen at all?
Its protest genuinely deserves a real, considered answer, not a quick dismissal. Effort absolutely still matters. For the practical, physical steps any given situation genuinely calls for. Nobody here is suggesting you should stop applying, stop reaching out, stop doing the reasonable things that remain available to you. What doesn't actually help and what consistently works against you instead is the anxious, repetitive mental effort layered on top of those practical steps. The constant checking, the endless rehearsing, the catastrophizing, the ongoing inner monitoring of whether the whole thing has worked yet at any given moment. There's a way to think about this that might make the discomfort considerably easier to sit with going forward. The chasing state was never actually protecting the outcome you wanted,
However much it may have felt that way in the moment.
it only ever felt like protection. In roughly the same way that biting your nails
Might feel like it's relieving anxiety, even as it does absolutely nothing to address the actual source of that anxiety underneath.
letting go of the chase isn't dropping your guard on something genuinely valuable. It's dropping a habit that was never actually doing the job you'd quietly assigned to it, freeing up the considerable energy it had been consuming for something far more useful instead. The quiet, settled assumption that's actually capable of meaningfully shaping what comes next in your life. Recognizing when you've slipped back into chasing, because this shift is never a single one-time decision, but ongoing daily practice. It genuinely helps to know the specific signs that you've drifted back into chasing, fully noticing it happening in real time. These particular signs tend to be remarkably consistent from person to person, regardless of what the specific desire in question happens to be about. A tightening sensation in the chest or stomach whenever the subject comes to mind, rather than a settled, easy warmth in its place. A persistent pull to check, refresh, or revisit something considerably more often than the actual situation genuinely calls for. Mental rehearsal of a feared outcome that hasn't happened yet. Quite possibly may never happen at all. A creeping sense that your peace today depends entirely on some specific piece of confirmation you haven't received yet. Explaining your situation to other people with a kind of visible urgency that leaves you feeling more anxious afterward rather than less. Every single sign. None of these particular signs are a reason for harsh self-criticism the moment you happen to notice them in yourself.
Slips back into chasing sometimes, often without realizing it until they're already several days deep into the pattern again.
The genuinely useful move, the instant you do notice, isn't to berate yourself for having slipped back. It's simply to return gently and without drama to the settled state you'd been carefully cultivating before the chase quietly took over control again. Noticing the slip itself is the practice actually working as intended, not the practice failing you. Patience that isn't gritted teeth. The word patience often conjures a specific image of gritted teeth, enduring something difficult, holding on tightly, waiting out a hard stretch through sheer stubborn willpower until relief finally, eventually arrives. That particular version of patience is genuinely exhausting to sustain over any length of time.
And it's honestly not the version this teaching is actually pointing toward at all.
There's a different kind of patience available instead. One that doesn't require enduring anything whatsoever.
Because it isn't waiting anxiously for relief at all. It's already fully at rest. Right now. In this moment.
This is the patience of someone who already knows perfectly well how a familiar, beloved story ends,
And therefore doesn't feel any real urgency at all, while reading calmly through the middle chapters. They're not gritting their teeth through the suspense.
They're genuinely enjoying the unfolding itself,
because the ending was never truly in doubt for them to begin with.
This kind of settled patience isn't something you can force yourself into purely through raw willpower alone.
Trying to grit your way forcefully into settled ease is a direct contradiction that quietly undoes itself the very moment you attempt it that way.
It's something that develops naturally instead,
As the underlying assumption gradually deepens,
The more consistently you return to it over time, rather than abandoning it at the first sign of difficulty.
in the very beginning.
the settled feeling might only last a few minutes before old
Familiar anxiety creeps quietly back in. And that's genuinely fine. It's exactly where absolutely everyone starts out with this practice.
Over time, with consistent, gentle return rather than forceful, strained effort, those settled minutes tend to
Gradually stretch longer and longer, until eventually the settled state, rather than the old chase,
becomes the considerably more familiar and more natural
of the two options available to you.
building the daily practice.
So how does all of this actually
Translate it into something you can genuinely do, starting tonight and continuing in the days ahead,
Rather than remaining just another nice idea you nod along with tonight and then quietly forget about entirely by tomorrow morning?
start by choosing just one specific desire you've been chasing hardest?
not everything all at once, just the single one costing you the most peace right now.
Set aside a few genuinely quiet minutes for yourself. Ideally at a time when you won't be interrupted by anything.
And instead of picturing all the individual steps standing between here
And the eventual outcome.
picture instead a short, specific scene taken from some time after it's already been fully resolved. Not the process of getting there at all. The calm, entirely ordinary aftermath of it being done.
Feel what that particular moment would actually feel like in your own body. Not performed or exaggerated excitement,
But the specific, quieter, physical sensations of genuine relief, of a matter finally settled for good, of no longer needing to check for anything at all.
Stay with that feeling for a few minutes without straining to make it feel more dramatic or intense than it
Naturally wants to be on its own. Then let the exercise close naturally and go about the rest of your day in a perfectly normal way.
If the old familiar urge to check, follow up unnecessarily, or mentally rehearse worst-case scenarios arises again later on, and it very likely will, especially in the beginning, notice it without alarm or self-judgment, and gently return to the settled feeling rather than fighting the urge head-on.
Repeat this practice daily, not as another anxious obligation you're tracking carefully on a checklist somewhere, but as a quiet, genuinely ordinary habit.
The same way you might return to brushing your teeth each morning without needing to work up any particular
that beforehand.
Over the course of days and weeks, the settled feeling tends to gradually become less like a deliberate exercise you're performing, and
More like simply how you naturally relate to this particular desire going forward.
at which point, quite reliably and predictably. The chasing itself tends to fall away entirely on its own because it was genuinely never necessary to begin with in the first place.
The story tries to reassert itself.
At some point along this path, you'll very likely encounter a moment that seems on its surface to confirm the old chasing story all over again. A delay, a disappointing sign,
A piece of news, it appears at first glance to argue directly against
everything you've been quietly settling into. This is genuinely not a failure of the practice itself. It's simply the exact moment where the practice actually matters the most.
the natural instinct in a moment like this is to treat the setback as final, conclusive proof,
To abandon the settled state entirely, rush headlong back into anxious chasing,
as though the mere appearance of difficulty automatically
Outweighs everything you've been quietly building up until now.
But a single discouraging appearance was never actually the final word on anything. It's simply one scene along a much longer, mostly invisible process,
arriving in a particular form that looks, for the moment at least,
like the exact opposite of what you're genuinely hoping for. The genuinely useful response here isn't to argue loudly with the appearance out loud.
It isn't to pretend it never happened either. Denying reality in the opposite direction.
It's to acknowledge it plainly and honestly. This is simply what's showing up today.
Without handing it the full authority to redefine your entire inner state going forward.
Not drama. Return to the settled feeling you cultivated. Return to the
Underlying assumption itself. Returned to the quiet certainty you'd been carefully building before the setback showed up unannounced. To test it.
each return,
especially the ones that happen immediately after a genuinely discouraging appearance, tends to be exactly the ones that matter the most of all, because they're the ones that actually prove to yourself more than anyone else that the new state is genuinely stronger
Then the old habit ever was. Closing.
So here's what I genuinely want to leave you with tonight. The thing you've been chasing was never actually going to be caught by chasing harder.
Chasing, however sincere the intention behind it, however well meant, quietly confirms the very absence you're desperately trying to end.
What actually closes that distance in practice is the exact opposite motion entirely.
settling rather than endlessly reaching, assuming rather than continuously pursuing.
Choose the one desire tonight that's been costing you the most lately. The one you've genuinely chasing hardest of all. Set it down for just a few minutes, not by forcing yourself to stop caring about it, but by consciously shifting into the felt sense of already having resolved it completely.
Let that feeling be quiet and genuinely ordinary rather than forced or dramatic.
Then deliberately show your grip on needing any proof by morning. Whatever shows up tomorrow, meet it from that newly settled place rather than from the old anxious one been operating from. When the pull to chase inevitably returns, and it likely will,
At least for a while yet. Don't fight it directly.
just return as many times as it genuinely takes to the state of already having what you've been reaching for all along. Once you stop chasing, and instead quietly assume has a genuine way of finding its own path toward you, in its own time, along a road you were never actually required to force open yourself. This has been the Neville Archive.
I'll see you in the next